The First World War was not fought in shining fields or heroic charges, as many imagined at the dawn of the 20th century. Instead, it descended into something far darker, slower, and more terrifying. This video takes you deep into the trenches of World War I, narrow scars carved into the earth where millions lived, suffered, and died. You will witness how soldiers survived surrounded by mud, rats, disease, constant bombardment, and an enemy only meters away. You will hear real accounts of daily life, psychological collapse, unexpected humanity, and the brutal reality of industrialized war. This is the story of the trenches, told through facts, testimonies, and the voices of those who were there. If you enjoy these war journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. This helps others find their way here too. For now, let's begin our journey. When the war began in 1914, European generals believed it would be short. Many soldiers marched to the front convinced they would be home by Christmas. What awaited them instead was a new kind of warfare, one that would trap entire armies underground for years. The trenches first appeared as a temporary solution. Soldiers dug shallow holes to protect themselves from machine gun fire and artillery. But as the front lines froze in place, these holes evolved into vast trench systems stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had become a continuous wound across Europe, nearly 750 kilometers long. A typical trench was far more complex than a simple ditch. There was the frontline trench closest to the enemy, where soldiers stood guard day and night. Behind it ran support trenches and reserve trenches, connected by communication trenches that zigzagged to prevent explosions from traveling straight through. From above, these networks looked like enormous underground cities carved into the soil. Life in the frontline trench was defined by mud. In places like Flanders, rain turned the ground into a thick, suffocating swamp. Soldiers often stood in water for days or weeks at a time. Boots rotted, feet swelled, cracked, and became infected in a condition known as trench foot. In severe cases, the flesh turned black and gangrenous, requiring amputation. Medical reports from the British Army show that trench foot alone incapacitated tens of thousands of soldiers. The smell was impossible to escape. Rotting bodies lay buried in the trench walls or in no man's land between enemy lines. Latrines overflowed. Sweat, smoke, decay, and chemical residue filled the air. Soldiers wrote in their diaries that even after leaving the trenches, the stench followed them in their memories for the rest of their lives. Rats were constant companions. They grew fat feeding on corpses and food scraps. Many soldiers described rats the size of cats, fearless and aggressive. At night, men could feel them running over their bodies as they tried to sleep. Some woke to find rats gnawing at their fingers or faces. Attempts to kill them were mostly futile. Where one died, dozens more appeared. Sleep itself was a luxury. Artillery fire never truly stopped. Even during quiet periods, the threat of sudden bombardment loomed. Soldiers slept in short bursts, often sitting upright, weapons in hand. The fear of a surprise enemy attack meant someone always had to be awake. Prolonged sleep deprivation became a silent weapon of the war. Every morning and evening, soldiers stood on the fire step during what was known as stand-to. Dawn and dusk were the most likely times for an enemy assault. Even in freezing rain or thick fog, men climbed up, peering over the parapet, fingers numb on their rifles, hearts racing as they waited for movement across no man's land. No man's land itself was a place of nightmares. It was a strip of land ranging from a few meters to hundreds of meters wide, filled with shell craters, barbed wire, and bodies. Grass rarely grew there. Soldiers sent on night patrols described the ground as soft and uneven, sometimes realizing too late they were stepping on human remains buried just beneath the surface. Psychological strain was constant. The trenches created a state of permanent anticipation, waiting for death, never knowing when it would come. Soldiers lived under the understanding that survival depended largely on luck. A shell could land anywhere at any time. Many veterans later said the randomness of death was harder to endure than the violence itself. Letters from the front reveal how soldiers tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. They wrote about food, weather, and trivial details, carefully avoiding the horrors around them to spare their families. Yet censorship also played a role. Military authorities removed descriptions of suffering, disease, and despair, creating a sanitized version of trench life for those back home. Food was another daily battle. Rations often arrived cold, late, or spoiled. Bread hardened like stone, meat was frequently canned and tasteless. Water was scarce and often contaminated. In some sectors, soldiers collected rainwater or melted frost just to drink. Despite this, moments of shared meals became rare points of comfort and camaraderie. Despite the brutality, moments of humanity survived. Soldiers from opposing sides sometimes heard each other singing across the trenches at night. During Christmas 1914, in several sectors, spontaneous truces emerged. Men climbed out of their trenches, exchanged gifts, buried the dead, and even played football. These events were quickly suppressed by command, but they revealed something deeply human beneath the machinery of war. Weapons defined trench warfare. The machine gun dominated the battlefield, capable of cutting down entire waves of attacking infantry in seconds. Artillery caused the majority of casualties, not bullets. Shellfire reshaped the land endlessly, destroying trenches as quickly as they were built. Soldiers became expert diggers, rebuilding defenses overnight under fire. Gas introduced a new terror. Chlorine, phosgene, and later mustard gas drifted silently into trenches, burning lungs and blinding eyes. Gas masks became essential, but early versions were crude and unreliable. Panic caused faster than the gas itself, as soldiers struggled to put on masks in time. By 1916, the trench system had become a prison. Rotations offered brief relief, a few days or weeks behind the lines, but soldiers knew they would return. Many described the trenches as a living entity, something that consumed men physically and mentally. As this war of attrition dragged on, the trenches stopped being temporary shelters. They became the war itself. And for those trapped inside them, survival was not about heroism, it was about endurance. By the second year of the war, trench life had become routine, and that routine was slowly destroying the men who lived it. What shocked new recruits most was not always the violence, but the monotony. Days passed with nothing happening, followed by minutes of absolute chaos. This constant shift between boredom and terror pushed the human mind to its limits. A soldier's day began before sunrise. Stand to at dawn meant climbing onto the fire step, scanning the horizon through mist and smoke. Fingers trembled, not only from cold, but from the tension of knowing that an enemy charge could erupt without warning. Many attacks began exactly at this hour, when visibility was low and exhaustion was high. Once daylight settled, repair work began. Trenches were fragile. Rain collapsed walls, artillery shattered parapets, and bodies sometimes had to be integrated into the structure itself because removing them was impossible. Soldiers packed mud, sandbags, and wooden planks into place, often while under sniper fire. Diaries from British and German soldiers described repairing trenches as more exhausting than combat itself. Sanitation was primitive at best. Latrines were little more than pits dug into the ground.
When shelling destroyed them, waste flowed into the trenches. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, typhoid, and lice infestations were constant. Lice caused trench fever, a painful illness that left soldiers weak and delirious. Some men burned their clothes over candles to kill the parasites, risking punishment or injury just to escape the itching. The trenches were alive with sound, the whistle of incoming shells, the dull thud of distant artillery, the crack of rifles, and the constant buzzing of flies. At night, the soundscape changed. Shovels scraping earth, whispered commands, and the eerie cries of wounded men lying in no man's land. Soldiers were often forbidden from rescuing them, as doing so could expose the trench to enemy fire. Many accounts describe the haunting guilt of listening to comrades die just meters away. Snipers turned fear into a constant presence. A careless movement, a raised helmet, or a glint of light could mean instant death. Soldiers learned to move slowly, to keep their heads down, and to use periscopes made from mirrors to observe the enemy. Some units lost dozens of men to snipers alone without ever seeing the shooter. Night brought a different kind of danger. Patrols crept into no man's land to cut enemy wire, gather intelligence, or retrieve bodies. These missions were silent and terrifying. One wrong step could trigger a flare, bathing the land in white light and exposing soldiers to machine gun fire. Veterans later described these patrols as the most psychologically draining experiences of the war. The fear of attack was constant, but attacks themselves were rare and devastating. When the order came to go over the top, soldiers climbed out of the trench and advanced across open ground toward enemy lines. Despite massive artillery preparation, barbed wire often remained intact, machine guns survived, and casualties were horrific. At battles like the Somme and Passchendaele, tens of thousands were killed in a single day. Survivors remembered the sight of men falling around them like grass cut by a scythe. After an attack, the trenches filled with wounded. Medical aid was basic. Stretcher bearers worked under fire, carrying men through mud and debris. Many died before reaching aid stations. Morphine was scarce. Surgeons amputated limbs in field hospitals just behind the lines, often without adequate anesthesia. Infection was a greater threat than the wound itself. Shell shock emerged as one of the most misunderstood consequences of trench warfare. Soldiers began to shake uncontrollably, lose speech, or become unable to move. Some screamed endlessly, others became silent and distant. Early in the war, many officers believed shell shock was cowardice. Men were punished, even executed, for what was later recognized as severe psychological trauma. Letters and medical records reveal how deeply trench warfare shattered the human mind. Yet, amid the suffering, bonds formed that few civilians could understand. Camaraderie became a survival mechanism. Soldiers shared food, stories, and dark humor. Jokes about death and misery were common, not out of cruelty, but as a way to cope. Many veterans later said the men beside them mattered more than the cause of the war itself. Music echoed through the trenches. Soldiers sang songs from home, military marches, and improvised verses mocking officers or the enemy. These moments offered brief emotional escape. In rare, quiet sectors, enemy soldiers sometimes responded with their own songs, reminding both sides that they shared the same fear and exhaustion. Religion played a role, too. Chaplains held services in dugouts or open trenches, sometimes under fire. Soldiers prayed for survival, forgiveness, or simply an end to the war. Faith brought comfort to some, while others lost it entirely after witnessing relentless death. Weather was an enemy no army could defeat. Winter froze trenches solid, Water turned to ice, weapons malfunctioned. Summer brought heat, disease, and unbearable stench. At Passchendaele, rain was so heavy that men drowned in shell holes filled with mud. Official reports describe soldiers sinking beyond rescue, pulled down by their own equipment. Behind the lines, propaganda painted a different picture. Posters showed smiling soldiers and glorious victories. The reality in the trenches was exhaustion, fear, and despair. Many soldiers felt disconnected from civilians who could not understand what the war truly was. By 1917, morale began to crack. Mutinies erupted in some armies. Men refused to attack, believing further assaults were pointless slaughter. Commanders responded with discipline, executions, and promises of change. New tactics slowly emerged, but the trenches remained central to the war's brutality. For those who lived there, the trenches were not just a battlefield. They were a world where normal rules no longer applied, where survival depended on luck, brotherhood, and the ability to endure what no human should have to endure. And still, the war dragged on.
As the war dragged into its third and fourth years, the trenches became laboratories of death. What began as a conflict between nations turned into a relentless experiment in how efficiently human beings could destroy one another. Technology evolved faster than tactics, and soldiers were the ones who paid the price. Artillery dominated the battlefield more than any other weapon. By 1916, barrages could last for days or even weeks. Shells pulverized the ground until nothing recognizable remained. Entire landscapes were erased, replaced by craters filled with water, mud, and human remains. Soldiers described the earth itself as trembling constantly, as if it were alive and in pain. The psychological impact of artillery was immense. Even when shells did not hit, the constant concussion rattled the brain. Men learned to identify shells by sound, the deep roar of heavy guns, the shrill scream of incoming fire, the brief silence before impact. Many later recalled that this anticipation was worse than the explosion itself. New weapons changed trench warfare dramatically. Flamethrowers, introduced by German forces in 1915, turned trenches into corridors of fire. Survivors described the horror of watching flames roll through confined spaces, leaving no chance of escape. The psychological terror alone often caused enemy units to flee before the flames reached them. Gas warfare added another layer of fear. The first large-scale gas attack occurred at Ypres in April 1915, when chlorine gas drifted toward Allied trenches. Soldiers initially thought it was smoke. Moments later, men were choking, clawing at their throats as their lungs burned. Panic spread faster than the gas. Some survived by urinating on cloths and pressing them to their faces, a desperate improvisation that neutralized the chlorine slightly. Gas masks became standard equipment, but early models were crude. They restricted vision and breathing, turning every movement into a struggle. Mustard gas, introduced later, was particularly cruel. It burned skin, blinded eyes, and damaged lungs slowly. Victims often appeared uninjured at first, only to collapse hours later. Mustard gas lingered in the soil, contaminating trenches long after an attack ended. Machine guns continued to define trench defense. A single gun could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, making frontal assaults nearly suicidal. Soldiers learned that courage meant very little against industrial firepower. Many accounts describe waves of men advancing, only to be cut down before reaching the enemy wire. To counter this stalemate, armies turned to mining and countermining. Soldiers tunneled beneath enemy trenches, planting massive explosive charges. When detonated, these mines obliterated entire sections of the front. The explosion at Messines Ridge in 1917 was so powerful, it was reportedly heard in London. Soldiers described the ground rising like a wave before collapsing into fire and debris. Life underground was as dangerous as life in the trenches above. Tunnel collapses, suffocation, and underground firefights were common. Listening devices were used to detect enemy digging. When sounds were heard, frantic countermining began, turning the earth into a battlefield beneath the battlefield. Airplanes also entered the trench war. Initially used for reconnaissance, aircraft became tools for directing artillery fire. Observers in the sky could spot enemy movements and relay coordinates, making trenches even more vulnerable. This led to the rise of fighter pilots tasked with protecting or destroying reconnaissance planes. While air combat captured public imagination, soldiers below experienced it as yet another threat raining destruction from above. Tanks appeared late in the war, first at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Early models were slow, unreliable, and prone to mechanical failure. But when they worked, they changed everything. Tanks crushed barbed wire, crossed trenches, and provided moving cover for infantry. Soldiers on both sides described the sight of tanks emerging from smoke as surreal and terrifying. Despite technological advances, life in the trenches remained brutal. Equipment was heavy. Soldiers carried rifles, ammunition, gas masks, entrenching tools, and personal items, often weighing over 30 kilograms. Moving through mud under this weight exhausted men before combat even began. Command decisions seemed detached from reality. Orders came from distant headquarters based on outdated maps and delayed reports. Soldiers in the trenches felt like expendable pieces in a vast machine. Letters and memoirs frequently express bitterness toward high command, whom many believed did not understand trench warfare at all. Still, adaptation occurred. New infantry tactics emphasized small unit movement, coordination with artillery, and infiltration rather than mass charges. Stormtrooper units, particularly in the German army, trained for speed and surprise, slipping through weak points in enemy lines. These methods showed that the trench deadlock was not invincible. Medical care also improved slowly. Field hospitals became more organized. Blood transfusions, antiseptics, and better evacuation methods increased survival rates. Even so, survival often depended on how quickly a wounded soldier could be removed from the front. Morale fluctuated with the tides of war. Victories brought brief hope. Defeats deepened despair. Soldiers counted days, weeks, and months, marking time in a world where the future was uncertain and death ever present. By late 1917 and early 1918, the nature of trench warfare began to change. New strategies, combined arms tactics, and the arrival of fresh troops hinted that the stalemate might finally break. But for those who had endured years in the trenches, the damage was already done. The war had carved itself into their bodies and minds.
By 1918, the trenches that had dominated the war for nearly 4 years were no longer the unbreakable prisons they once seemed to be. The battlefield was changing, but the cost paid by those who had lived inside those narrow corridors of mud and death could never be undone. The final year of the war was marked by exhaustion on every front. Entire generations had been drained. Soldiers were older in spirit than in age. Many had survived years in the trenches, only to feel hollowed out by what they had witnessed. The optimism of 1914 was long gone, replaced by a grim determination to simply endure until the end. New tactics finally began to dismantle the trench stalemate. Combined arms warfare, the coordination of infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft allowed armies to punch through defensive lines without relying on mass frontal assaults. Artillery became more precise, firing creeping barrages that moved forward with advancing troops, offering protection rather than random destruction. Tanks, once unreliable experiments, became increasingly effective. When used in numbers and supported properly, they broke through barbed wire, crossed trenches, and shattered defensive positions that had resisted attack for years. Soldiers who had spent their lives crouched in trenches now saw the battlefield move again,
for the first time since the early days of the war. The German spring offensive of 1918 showed both the potential and the limits of this new warfare. Using infiltration tactics and stormtrooper units, German forces advanced rapidly, bypassing strongpoints rather than attacking them directly. For a brief moment, the static nature of trench warfare collapsed, but without sufficient supplies and reinforcements, the offensive eventually stalled. The Allied counteroffensives that followed marked the true end of trench dominance. With fresh American troops entering the war and morale rising, the front lines finally began to move decisively. The trenches, once symbols of permanence, were abandoned, overrun, or destroyed as armies advanced kilometers instead of meters. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, millions of soldiers emerged from the trenches for the last time. Some celebrated, others felt only numbness. For many, the war did not truly end that day. It followed them home. The physical scars were obvious: missing limbs, shrapnel wounds, blinded eyes. But the psychological wounds were far deeper and less visible. Veterans suffered nightmares, flashbacks, tremors, and emotional detachment. What had once been called shell shock would later be recognized as a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Society struggled to understand these men. Civilians wanted heroes and victory stories, not broken soldiers who could not sleep, work, or reconnect with their families. Many veterans felt isolated, unable to explain what trench life had done to them. Silence became common, not because there was nothing to say, but because there were no words strong enough. The landscapes of the former Western Front bore permanent marks of trench warfare. Even decades later, farmers uncovered bones, helmets, rifles, and unexploded shells. Entire regions were declared uninhabitable due to contamination. In some areas, the earth itself remained poisoned by chemicals and metal fragments. Cemeteries became vast and orderly, rows of identical crosses and stones stretching to the horizon. Many graves bore no names, only the words, "known unto God." These were men swallowed by the trenches, never identified, never returned home. Their families received no bodies, only silence. The trenches also reshaped military thinking forever. The romantic vision of war died in the mud of World War I. Nations realized that industrialized conflict meant mass death on an unimaginable scale. Military doctrines, international law, and political movements were all influenced by what happened between those earthen walls. Yet despite the horror, the trenches also revealed the extremes of human resilience. Men endured conditions that should have been unbearable. They found friendship in misery, humor in despair, and moments of compassion in a landscape built for cruelty. These small acts of humanity became acts of quiet rebellion against the dehumanization of war. Veterans who survived the trenches carried their experiences into the future. Some became writers, artists, and thinkers who tried to make sense of what they had seen. Their works shaped how future generations would understand war, not as glory, but as tragedy. The trenches were not just a military strategy, they were a symbol of a world tearing itself apart, a place where progress and brutality collided, where technology advanced faster than morality, where millions learned too late the true cost of modern war. Today, the trenches no longer dominate battlefields, but their legacy remains. Every conflict that followed carries lessons written in the mud of World War I. Lessons about leadership, sacrifice, and the price paid when humanity is buried beneath ideology and steel. The men who lived and died in those trenches did not choose the world they were thrown into, but through their suffering, they changed history. The trenches ended.
their scars did not. If you stayed until the end of this documentary, comment the word trenches below so we know you watched it all the way through. Let us know what part impacted you the most, or what fact surprised you about life in the trenches of World War I. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and keep watching the next documentaries that are appearing on your screen now. There are many more real stories of war, survival, and history waiting for you.